The horrors of slavery in the United States are well documented, yet one of the darkest and most dehumanizing aspects of the institution remains largely ignored: the existence of breeding farms. These farms were places where enslaved men and women were forcibly made to reproduce, treated as mere commodities to increase the enslaved population. This grotesque practice, sanctioned by both Southern plantation owners and the government, speaks to the lengths to which slavery was institutionalized as a system of cruelty and exploitation. The concept of breeding farms wasn't merely about human reproduction. It was about viewing human beings as property whose value could be increased through forced procreation. The horrific truth of breeding farms and slavery reveals the brutality that enslaved families faced, as well as the profound psychological, emotional, and physical toll that this practice took on those involved. In the antebellum South, the breeding farm phenomenon was particularly prevalent in states like South Carolina, Louisiana, and Georgia, where large plantations and farms were reliant on a constant influx of enslaved labor to work the cotton, tobacco, and sugar fields. To meet this need, slave owners devised systems that encouraged forced reproduction among their slaves. Rather than treating enslaved people as individuals with basic human rights, they were reduced to mere breeding machines, valued solely for their ability to produce more slaves. At the core of this practice was the belief that African slaves could be more profitable if they were able to breed and thus expand the labor force. In some cases, slave owners even made a profit from the sale of their enslaved children. These children, born into slavery, were viewed as immediate assets to the plantation economy, and their birth was often celebrated, but not as a new life, rather as an increase in property. Breeding farms were not just places of forced labor. They were institutions built upon the complete disregard for human dignity. Enslaved women, often young, were forced into sexual relationships with enslaved men, or sometimes with white men, by the slave owners themselves. These women had no control over their bodies, and their reproductive rights were non-existent. If a woman failed to produce children after being paired with a man, she was often subjected to even more intense abuse, both physical and emotional. The practice of breeding was not just about creating more slaves, it was about controlling and manipulating the bodies of enslaved people for profit. The enslaved women, especially, suffered under the weight of this system. Many of them were forced to give birth multiple times during their lives, often under harsh conditions, and with little medical care. Their bodies became a site of exploitation, as they were repeatedly impregnated for the sole purpose of increasing the plantation's workforce. Pregnancy and childbirth became a cycle of violence for these women, stripping them of their autonomy and reducing them to nothing more than vessels for reproduction. The conditions on breeding farms were, as you might expect, horrific. These farms were often located far from towns, isolated from any law or justice that might protect them. Enslaved men and women were kept in confined quarters, shackled, and sometimes subjected to physical punishment if they didn't meet the expectations set by the slave owners. This abuse was not limited to women. Enslaved men were also abused, forced into these sexual relationships with women in the name of breeding. The emotional toll on these men, who were often separated from their families and subjected to this violence, was unfathomable. One particularly infamous breeding farm, the McGee Plantation in Georgia, made headlines for its systematic abuse of enslaved people. The owner, Jacob McGee, was known for his business practices of selling enslaved children and forcing women to bear children. It's said that McGee even kept records of his enslaved women's menstrual cycles, calculating the most efficient time to pair them with male slaves for procreation. This was a chilling example of how slavery dehumanized people to the point that their very bodily functions were monitored, not for care, but for profit. For the women forced into these circumstances, The physical toll of frequent pregnancies, childbirths, and the subsequent care of children was immense. Enslaved women on breeding farms often faced premature aging, poor health, and eventually death from the conditions they endured. Many children, born on breeding farms, were separated from their mothers shortly after birth, sold off to other plantations, or placed into labor themselves. Yet, despite the overwhelming force of the system, resistance did exist. Many enslaved people managed to find ways to resist the dehumanizing practices they were subjected to. Some women chose not to have children, using various methods to prevent pregnancy, while others attempted to escape the violent grasp of the breeding farms. Though this resistance was difficult and often met with severe punishment, the very act of defying such a brutal system was an act of survival and defiance. The trauma of breeding farms did not end with the forced reproduction of enslaved people. It continued to echo through generations. The systematic exploitation and violence inflicted upon enslaved individuals in breeding farms left deep emotional, psychological, and physical scars that lasted well beyond slavery's end. The children born into slavery on these farms faced lives of brutal oppression, deprived of any basic human rights, treated as nothing more than property. For them, survival was not just about enduring harsh physical labor. It was about surviving the lifelong trauma of being raised in an institution designed to dehumanize. The children born on breeding farms were particularly vulnerable. They were often sold at a very young age, separating them from their mothers and families, who were already in a state of emotional and physical degradation. The slave market itself was a dehumanizing system that commodified children, often tearing apart families and leaving lifelong emotional scars. In these auctions, families were auctioned off as separate units, with mothers and fathers forced to watch as their children were sold to the highest bidder. These children were not raised to be educated, nurtured, or loved. They were raised to work. The life of an enslaved child was one of labor, abuse, and subjugation. The psychological toll of growing up in this environment was devastating. Many children grew up without any understanding of their worth as individuals. They were taught that their sole purpose was to work, produce, and survive under a system that saw them as property. For these children, survival meant enduring the violence and brutality of their surroundings, often with no opportunity to escape or resist. The conditions on breeding farms were often much harsher than those of regular plantations. The forced pairing of men and women, the manipulation of enslaved bodies for reproduction, created a constant state of tension, fear, and violence. For women, the continuous cycle of pregnancy and childbirth, with little medical care or rest, took a heavy toll on their health. Many died prematurely due to the strain placed on their bodies, while others were left mentally and physically broken by years of repeated abuse. The children born from these pregnancies were often neglected, forced to live in unsanitary conditions, and subjected to labor at a very young age. The children of breeding farms were not immune to the violence that characterized their parents' lives. As they grew older, they were often subjected to the same harsh realities. The moment they were old enough, they were put to work in the fields or forced into domestic servitude, continuing the cycle of exploitation. They were taught to believe that their lives were worthless, and any attempt at resistance or escape was met with brutal punishment. The children raised in these farms were a direct product of a system that dehumanized them and made them tools for economic profit. For the enslaved men and women, the emotional impact of living in such an environment was equally severe. The constant fear of being sold or separated from their families caused immense psychological distress. Enslaved women, in particular, lived under the constant threat of sexual violence, and their worth was often measured by their ability to bear children. For men, their lives were reduced to the ability to breed, and they were forced to participate in these practices against their will. The stripping of personal agency and the abuse of their bodies for profit left deep emotional scars that many could never fully recover from. The resistance to these practices was rare but powerful. While many enslaved people were unable to directly confront the system that held them captive, they found small ways to resist. Some women used herbal remedies or other methods to prevent pregnancy. Others attempted to escape or sabotage the work they were forced to do. For those who managed to escape, the journey to freedom was often fraught with danger. Many turned to the Underground Railroad, risking their lives in the hope of finding freedom in the northern states or Canada. For those who remained on the farms, resistance often took the form of rebellion, small acts of defiance, and the preservation of culture and identity in the face of a system that sought to erase them. The legacy of the breeding farms, however, is one that has not been fully acknowledged. The emotional, psychological, and physical trauma experienced by those subjected to these inhumane practices has left a lasting mark on African American communities. The dehumanization of black bodies, the destruction of families, and the constant exploitation of human life are foundational aspects of American slavery that continue to affect descendants of enslaved people today. The practice of breeding people for economic gain didn't just create physical scars. It created a system of racial oppression that affected the very fabric of American society. The scars left by slavery, by breeding farms, and by the systemic abuse of enslaved people run deep. The generations of children born into slavery carried the trauma of their ancestors, and the ripple effects of that trauma can still be seen in the ongoing fight for racial equality and justice. In conclusion, the breeding farms of slavery are among the most horrific chapters in the history of human cruelty. They serve as a stark reminder of the brutal exploitation of human beings for profit, of the unimaginable violence and emotional toll inflicted upon those subjected to this system. The lives of those born on these farms were marked by suffering, exploitation, and dehumanization. Their resistance, however small it may have been, was a testament to their strength and resilience. As we continue to reckon with the legacy of slavery in the United States, it is essential to remember the horrors of these breeding farms and the impact they had on the lives of millions. Their stories, though often forgotten, must be told.